Right, thank you very much. Following Will Hutton and following lunch is quite a difficult thing to do. I'll try and do the Elvis impersonation as well, not really, but with the mic as well. That's a much kinder introduction than I once heard a chairman give. Someone said, "Have you got slides or have you got something to say?" I've got quite a few slides, actually, but I'll leave you to judge whether I've got anything to say. There's quite a bit of detail on the slides, a few references and things like that, so we'll make sure they get circulated. Now, as you said, I'm sort of billed here under the Scottish Universities Insight Institute, which I'm the director of. That's a joint venture of 7 universities which sponsors knowledge exchange between academics and policymakers and practitioners, but also wear another couple of hats which I think are relevant. Not chair of EDAS, vice chair of EDAS. And I'm also a mediator as well. And you might not be able to see this picture here, but this was at the Copenhagen COP conference in 2009, I think it was. And there is no Planet B, the poster says. I was there with a group of mediators trying to encourage people to look at the negotiations around climate change as less of a zero-sum game and more about where some of the positive developments could come from. Whether we were successful in that, who knows? But then we've got this year we've got the COP climate change conference coming up in Glasgow. So a significant day, and in a way, has enough happened between what happened in Copenhagen and Glasgow, where we had the Paris agreement, a fairly significant step forward, but to a certain extent, things were knocked off track a wee bit by the financial crisis, which came pretty hard on around the time of the Copenhagen conference. And there is always a danger that the urgent does crowd out the important, and quite possibly what's going on at the moment is something that we have to think about in terms of, while we deal with the urgent, we also pay sufficient attention to the important as well. So first slide there, I say a lot of detail. This is from the IPCC report following the Paris Agreement on what you need to do in order to stick to a 1.5 degree rise in average temperatures. I don't expect you to look a lot at the detail. The main point to emphasize here is this graph here shows what has to happen to carbon emissions to actually have any chance of hitting the 1.5 target. As you can see, a fairly precipitous drop from where we are now, from around the high 30s. The point is that the pledges that have been made under Paris, under the Paris Accord at the moment, are showing emissions in the 52 to 58 trillion emissions, so way above where we have to get to. So there's no question that it's an emergency. It might not be an emergency that's on the scale or on the immediacy of the one we're facing with the coronavirus at the moment, but it is definitely an emergency. And the Principles for Responsible Investment group from the UN tried to sort of summarize this slide, which would summarize the IPCC work, which sort of demonstrates the transformations that are actually going to be needed in the way in which we do things in order to have a chance of hitting the 1.5 degree target. And the quote at the bottom, if you can read that emphasizes the point that in looking at climate change, then doing what's needed as far as the climate's concerned actually gives you lots of opportunities as far as doing things as far as other elements of sustainable and inclusive development are concerned. If you don't do them, what you need to do as far as climate change is concerned, you have a detrimental effect on those other things as well. So this transformation is with us. Now, responding to, I think it was an earlier question about, we've got all of these sort of priorities and how do we organize things and what sort of frameworks do we use for them, then one of the things I wanted to sort of broaden this out into was to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN and that has been agreed at the UN, which is a sort of global language, really, for talking about what sustainable and inclusive development is. And so it's a shared, I call it there, a shared articulation of intent. So there are the 17 goals, and there are an associated 169 specific targets looking to guide policy and practice. So, if you like, I mean, this is a pretty major sort of step forward on which to build, to say, at a global level, there is an articulation of what we need to do across the board in order to achieve sustainable and inclusive development. So it's something that we should build on. And indeed, as Gary may say more, the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework is explicitly linked into those sustainable development goals. So it is a sort of national framework for planning, managing, monitoring, organising what's done. And then there are various examples around the world. This one is from the province of Cordoba in Argentina, of where government at a subnational level has said, well, how can we take the sustainable development goals and use them around sort of headings of people, prosperity, and the planet. So there are examples at local government level as well about how these can be used. And one recent report, which I think was published last month by the OECD, which I would think is very worthwhile having a look at, is around this sort of territorial approach to sustainable development goals. And it spells out, and I've had a number of quotes here from it, about the opportunities and responsibilities that there are for local government to actually address this, using infrastructure, planning, economic business development, and the procurement that we were talking about this morning as well. So not only is a massive opportunity for local government, but it's a key responsibility as well. And they're saying that of those 169 targets, at least 105 are not going to be reached unless local government is actively and fully engaged in it. So that's the first point I really wanted to make, that we have a sort of framework for thinking coherently about sustainable and inclusive development. We should build on that and use that. Second group of comments I want to make is really around, as part of doing that, we need to sort of reimagine and reframe a number of the things that we think about when we think about the economy. And reframing is a technique that we use quite a lot within the world of mediation to actually try and help people sort of look at things from a slightly different perspective. The language you use can be quite important here. So I just really I'm going to run through a few things here to just sort of highlight some areas where maybe a bit of reframing, a bit of reimagination might be helpful. Firstly, even reframing and reimagining the economy, moving from a situation where we think of the economy as this is something we have to do which generates money which we can use to pay for good things, and we can maybe use to clear up some of the bad things that might happen as well. Move away from that to more of a mindset which says, okay, this is about how do we organise production and exchange within society to do the things that we want to do? And that's what lies behind this model. This is one of the OECD's Better Life model, which looks at sort of various indicators of quality of life and material conditions and things for the future, and begins to talk about that. And this is where the talk of the sort of the well-being economy, or the economy of well-being, that comes from as well. The talk that the First Minister did at the TED Talk on that, sort of focusing on this notion of trying to put well-being at the centre and the heart of what's done. This is all about reframing what the economy is all about. And those of us in economic development, I think there's something very important for us here as well. And as we all know, the underlying feature of economic development, economic growth, is growth in productivity. But maybe we have to reframe that a bit as well. It's not just labour productivity, which is incredibly important, but it's also resource productivity, wider resource productivity, making sure that making the best use of all resources. It has to be another key reframe. Taxation, maybe that's another reframe as well. Not just viewed as something which is a burden on society to be avoided as far as possible, but is something to be actively used in the jargon of the economists to internalise the externalities, be they negative or be they positive, and to actually change the way we behave. And the IMF's done some interesting work, if you're interested in this, on the carbon tax, which might be one of the key ways in which you do internalise the externality of excess carbon emissions, and it's talking about a significant level of taxation, around $75 a tonne, in order to get anywhere near the 1.5 target. But there are some interesting local examples. British Columbia, I've highlighted there, in 2008, I think, introduced a carbon tax. But they didn't just introduce the carbon tax, they also had a dividend from that tax as well. So the two things used together, so a levy and a dividend. And a dividend using the resources raised through the carbon tax to mitigate the impact on those that were going to be most impacted by the tax. So thinking about that, and then I think they're moving it. They're gradually increasing the tax. Now they're up to about $40 a tonne of emissions as well, and actually using some of the money to be invested into renewable resources and other things. Further area of reframing around risk and actually viewing the problems of climate change as being a key business risk. The Bank of England and Mark Carney and his directors in particular have been very strong on this recently, that for those companies that don't embrace and understand this risk, the implications for them on all sorts of levels, be it demand for their products, people willing to work with them, investors being willing to invest in them, it's a significant potential impact. So much the same way as we're looking at the impact of the coronavirus on businesses and mitigating that risk, businesses need to, and business development advisors need to be advising about mitigating that risk as well. Value is another issue that might need to be reframed a bit more, and this ties in this quote at the bottom from the Harvard study of adult development, which looked at people who are now, I think, into their 70s. They've actually, various teams of researchers have followed them through their lives, and the one overriding conclusion that they make is about the importance that close relationships in those people's lives have had, more than money, more than IQ, more than anything else. Really, really important. We are, as to echo what Will Hutton said, we are social animals. And then finally, expenditure, reframing the notion of expenditure, and this will be quite well known to many of you. But this, so when does revenue spending actually become preventative investment? I mean, we all think we can think about investment in terms of the hard infrastructure, what we normally think of as capital, but maybe we need to be a little bit broader in terms of thinking about what investment is. How do we assess value? How do we build that into our models of appraisal? What's the appropriate discount rate to use if we are a bit more concerned about the future than we are now? All of these things, important things to think about, and maybe in this context as well, thinking about emergency expenditure and the like. When you look at what has been mobilised in terms of quantitative easing, in terms of trying to sort out the problems of the banking crisis, maybe it's another area of reframe. So where does this lead us all? Well, rather glibly, I've said it. Looking at various models, it seems that the future is round. Either in terms of the circular economy models, or I don't know if you've come across Kate Raworth's donut economics, quite a good model, interesting concept to look at, where she's talking about trying to have the economic activity is this green donut which stays within the planetary boundaries, but ensures a sufficiently strong social foundation as well. So that's a target for, if you like, for what economic development is about. I think the key overriding conclusion I would draw from it, that things are certainly becoming a lot less linear, and we need to think in a lot less linear fashion than maybe we have in the past. So it's much less of take, make, and dispose, and much more about how do we reuse and recycle activities. But that's going to put real pressure on managers, and back to your point again about the diversity of aims and things, real pressure on managers to try and think more systemically. It's quite easy to think about things in a linear fashion where you're looking for cause and effect and trying to think, well, okay, what do I need to do in order to sort that problem out? If you've got to be thinking about various different things which impinge upon each other, then that makes the whole task of management much, much harder and much more difficult. And at the back of your mind as well, you're always thinking, what are the unintended consequences of what might be happening here in the system? And just to press you even more on that front, I took this slide from another OECD report on productivity, which tries to, all of these things like infrastructure and geography and R&D and the like have their own little logo, and then so what they tried to do was say which other of these things in the circle impinge on this one, and you can see that virtually everything impinges on everything else as well. So thinking systemically is not easy, but simply because it's hard is not a reason not to do it. This is a bit of a digression for me. My great hero was in economics, Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish economist from the 1950s, who came up with the idea of cumulative and circular causation, reminding us that things often don't balance out. They'll move in virtuous or vicious cycles, things building on each other. So what he was saying, I think, is still very much relevant today. Whatever, and it's some external force can knock a cycle off track. So interesting to see what the current crisis leads us to. Let me try and draw to a conclusion. I'm throwing out a few thoughts and ideas for you to reflect on here. Back to climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals. Also in that IPCC report that I talked about earlier was a bit where they'd done some analysis of where are the trade-offs and where are the synergies between doing things that you need to do to mitigate climate change on the other Sustainable Development Goals. And certainly worth having a bit of a detailed look at this. But those things in brown are where there are trade-offs that really have to be thought about carefully. The things in blue are those things where there are potential synergies, where doing the right thing in one area can have an impact in another area. So there's quite a bit of work that has been done on this, as far as climate change in particular, but also as far as the Sustainable Development Goals more generally. And this is looking at how this is from a report that the UN put out last year. The Future is Now, again, another report I would recommend you having a look at if you're interested in showing the relationship between the goals and how synergies can be developed between them. And generally speaking, again, this chart shows the same thing. There are trade-offs to be considered, but there are more potential for synergies than there are trade-offs. So finally, back to the role of local government. Again, this is from that OECD report about the territorial approach to the Sustainable Development Goals, and emphasising the importance. This is around the sort of using a place-based approach to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. But obviously, as has been mentioned a couple of times before, local government has a key role to play in encouraging the cooperation and the engagement needed to look at this whole agenda on a systemic basis, and to build a sort of respectful dialogue that's needed, that allows the discussion, the argumentation that Will Hutton was talking about to take place in a productive way, because there will be differences of opinion. The important thing is how you manage those differences of opinion, how you generate innovation from it, Don't allow it to become destructive. Local government has a key role to play in that regard. So, what conclusions will I draw from this? Well, there is a climate emergency. It requires urgent action, both in mitigation and adaptation. And if you don't mitigate sufficiently, then the degree of investment in adaptation is going to have to be higher. It's a very multifaceted problem, but we have a framework for looking at it through the SDGs. I think we need to reimagine and reframe a lot of what we talk about in economic development. And we need to take a fairly systemic approach to looking at where there are real synergies that we can build on and real trade-offs that we must address and not shy away from. But if we're going to do that productively, then cooperation and engagement more widely is critical. And there's an area there, and that engagement has to be between places as well as within places. And there is obviously a very important role for local government in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to stand here, if that's okay with everyone. Conscious it's a Friday afternoon. Economists always have great diagrams, don't they? My name's Sara Thiam. I'm the Chief Executive of SCDI. Fully signed up member of the Will Hutton fan club. So disappointed he wasn't here in person so I could be a bit of a fangirl. I'm going to roughly divide what I say to you into 3 different parts. First of all, I'm going to do a bit of a shameless plug about SCDI and some of the things we're working on at present. I'm going to talk to you specifically about what we're doing on clean growth and how you might be able to get involved. And then I'm going to leave you with a few takeaways, hopefully, which will give you some food for thought, and I'm sure you have lots of questions for me. So who are we? We're a network of organisations across Scotland. In terms of the kind of things that we do, I think it's really worth saying that our members' commitment to creating a practical plan for a better Scotland for all is what really marks them out for me, and that's why I've come to SCDI. I'm a relatively new girl. I joined in June. But they bring insight to those pressing challenges and opportunities that are bigger than any one of our individual members or the sectors that they represent. And you saw on that first slide the real breadth of our convening power right across from global corporates to SMEs to local authorities to trade unions. We've got everybody in the room, social enterprises, charities. So as well as thinking about things, we also like to do things where we feel there's a need to do things. Productivity, I don't need to tell anybody in this room, is a huge challenge for our economy. And one of the things that we're doing in partnership with Scottish Government, we've been piloting this in Glasgow and Edinburgh, are our productivity clubs. And again, exactly the kind of SCDI ingredients you would expect, lots of different types of organisations and real sort of serendipitous learning going on. The key thing there is that it's peer-to-peer learning. It's not us trying to tell them how to do it. And what's really remarkable about those events is that I think organisations go along to those with the expectation that actually what they want to know is AI and data or good management or a number of other, things, different working patterns. And actually, very often they come away with a completely different learning point to the one they went in expecting or looking for. So a bit of a plug as well for our events programme. We've got our forum in Edinburgh in May. We maybe won't have our forum in Edinburgh in May. But if we don't have it in May, we will definitely have it in September. And we do events right across Scotland, right throughout the year. I think the other kind of key characteristic of SCDI is the fact that we're thinking about the whole of Scotland. We have regional committees in Inverness, Highlands and Islands, north east of Scotland, but now also south of Scotland as well. So our thinking is always flavoured by place. people that have got engineering, science, technology, engineering, math skills are actually the people that are going to help us deal with some of the challenges of climate change, the massive disruption that our economy's changing, the Uberization, if you like, of our economy. And they're going to make our lives better. We need a heck of a lot more of them. So one of the things that we do is our young engineering science clubs right across Scotland in schools. But I think increasingly I am very conscious, having come from an industry, an engineering industry, where the focus was very much on those technical skills, that actually alongside those technical skills we also need those communication skills, those stakeholder engagement skills. I hate the term soft skills. They are essential skills. And actually the people that have both can do the most extraordinary things. They also tend to be leaders in my experience. So we really work in partnership in terms of our STEM outreach, but I think it's that vital interface between industry, between schools and the world of work. So we develop really interesting activities and things to do with industry that can really help inspire young people to think about their future career. So last year, and in joining SCDI, within a short space of my joining SCDI, it was very, very clear. We all had a bit of a wake-up call, didn't we, last year? We kind of knew climate change was really quite serious and we had to do something about it. But actually, all of a sudden, it just gathered scale and pace. And, you know, not least thanks to young Greta. So last year, as you know, Scottish Parliament has approved a really ambitious new target to reduce emissions by 75%. By 2030. And they also baked inclusive growth into that legislation, which is unique in the world. The Scottish Government's also updating its climate change plan, and that sets out the actions that we're going to need to take to reduce our emissions by 66% by 2032. It is absolutely phenomenal, the scale and pace of the change. And many of you are from cities and towns that have set really ambitious targets. Targets matter. They demonstrate leadership, but they're just the start. So I was really delighted to be along here today to be able to talk to you about this, because I think that lead now needs to be matched by all organisations. We need to act now to invest in those low-carbon neutral economic models, and Charlie's got some really nice diagrams of those, but also identifying those wider complementary actions. The thing about challenging targets is that they can really stimulate entrepreneurship and commercial innovation. You understand this and you know how to do it. And industry understands it. Business and industry understands it and knows how to do it. But you also understand that there's economic opportunity for Scotland in terms of exporting those technologies and that knowledge that we're developing, that we're piloting and that we're deploying. So it's in our interests to do this at home because we can sell it abroad. So in the next 25 years, we've got to get to net zero. That's not negotiable. But it requires a fundamental transformation of how we live and how we do business. Our economy's underpinned by fossil fuels. It's not a time to point the finger. It's not a time to blame the bad guys. It's time for us all to lean in. We're living our lives as if there are 3 planets. We've actually only got one. But we've built our economy as if there are 3 planets. So the challenge for us is turning that around. So why should SCDI be involved? Well, our roots lie in the economic depression, the Great Depression of the 1930s. And in the post-World War II period, our economy was under huge strain. International boundaries and relationships were being redrawn. Domestic inequalities were significant. Society was fractured. Things are so different now, aren't they? So what our members did then was they responded with a level of ambition that was matched to those challenges of the day. You saw things like the Empire Exhibition, all of those types of things in our glorious past. But they're stepping up to the plate again. And I know and I can see that local authorities are also doing that. But getting to net zero requires a strategic approach that allows all parts of society to contribute practically. Our broad convening power means that we are uniquely placed to create that shared platform for dialogue and for action. It's that safe space, and I really like Charlie's language around mediation here, because this is about trade-offs. Because we're one of the few organisations, and local authorities are like this too, where you can bring campaigners and business and industry together into the room. So the work that we do can actually support organisations to do the right thing, and it can create wealth and well-being. So for cash-strapped local authorities, the balance of cost, the types of financial incentives and regulation and development are absolutely at the forefront of your mind. And I think until very recently, an awful lot of us thought that a sequential transition where we could progress sector by sector, power, heat, energy, transport, agriculture, we thought that kind of transition was that sequential approach would fix this, but we know that that's no longer viable. We talked about important and urgent. This is both important and urgent, and we need to tackle these things simultaneously. But I think, again, the expertise that local government has around regeneration and placemaking and managing all of those multiple and complex factors makes you uniquely placed to take the lead in this area. Waiting's no longer an option. Again, Charlie said it, deferring the action just means we'll have to spend more, much more, on adapting to higher temperatures and the associated destructive climate impacts. And I don't need to tell authorities in Scotland who are dealing with flooding about that kind of thing. So the Committee on Climate Change made clear that transition was technically achievable, but the scale of change is enormous, and the transition, the accelerated pace at which the transition needs to take place is a challenge. In Scotland, we've seen before those impacts of the swift economic transitions on particular regions and particular sectors. Our history makes us keenly aware of the need for industrial change, which supports that economic diversification, those new jobs, those decent livelihoods. But as with all change, it has to be managed to avoid unintended consequences. So many of our members have already signed up to working with SCDI to our Clean Growth Leadership Group. What they are going to be doing is developing a route map to 2045 and trying to ensure that the instruments that are being set up to finance the transition are fit for purpose, pinpoint the clean growth opportunities that can drive that economic growth and that carbon neutrality. So where do we start from? What's our starting point? Well, Scotland's made significant progress in reducing our contribution to climate change. We've managed to reduce emissions, and we've also managed to grow the economy. But we need to do it again, and we need to do it twice as much. So we've done the easy stuff. It gets a wee bit harder now. So massive decrease in emissions from the power sector, particularly through renewable energy in Scotland, and nearly 90% reduction, which is phenomenal. So great foundations, and we have lots of the right ingredients. We've got world-class research, world-class universities, and we're getting on with it. A lot of our power companies that are Scotland-based are disinvesting in traditional fossil fuels. But how are we going to manage that transition? Because it's not going to happen overnight. And how are we going to get all those gas boilers out of our homes? But as we've grown our economy, has it been inclusive? I don't think so. There's a soup kitchen outside my office if I leave later than 6 o'clock at night. This is a different world to the world I grew up in. So actually, we're not doing too well on inclusive growth. We say an awful lot of the right things in Scotland, and we've got really good language around this. But actually, in terms of day-to-day experience of individuals, it's not looking too good. So the leadership group's also going to build on and develop other bits of work that we've done and other thinking that we've done just in the last couple of years. Our most recent reports are around what Scotland's future skills profile looks like. The world of work's changing. What does that mean for the future of skills in Scotland? And how are our employers, our educators, our learners and our workers going to have to respond? So we made a number of recommendations for change, but technological, social and environmental change are going to be a huge part of that. And so there's going to need to be a huge focus on those net zero skills. Good news, we've actually got lots of highly transferable skills. Oil and gas, we've got phenomenal engineers in the northeast of Scotland. But actually, engineers are brilliant. I worked for them for 8 years. They can do anything. And the question about the bridge to Northern Ireland is not can it be built. Engineers can build anything. The question is, should it be built? Is it the right return on investment? I won't comment, but I won't comment. We've also, last year, again with our sort of whole of Scotland mission, thought specifically about what are the challenges for rural Scotland in all of this. And again, our model is always to partner with a range of our members to take a look. But we always have that multidisciplinary approach. So we will have big business and industry, but we'll also have local authorities. We will also have trade unions at the table. And in terms of some of the findings that came out of that work, that was really about the opportunities. You know, we had those sectors from all partners, and those are the kind of findings that we had. There are huge opportunities in rural Scotland. We can be building on that low-carbon infrastructure that we already have. We've done big investment in Scotland on the hard infrastructure. Bewley-Denny was about bringing the renewable energy from where it's generated to where it's used in the cities. And as we think about our blueprint, which will be out in the next month or so, which is looking at the Scottish economy 10 years ahead, what will Scotland's future look like? Actually, what's beginning to come home to us is there's a real opportunity. The ambitious climate change targets that Scotland has could mean that actually we are seen as the home of that sustainable business. We've got lots of the right skills, lots of the right knowledge. We're starting to do it for ourselves, and then we can export it later on. Okay, so to leave you with a few takeaways. Councils are in competition in many ways. You've been falling over each other to set incredibly ambitious targets around climate change, but actually there's really significant opportunities around collaborating. Somebody was talking earlier about regional level. I thought that word cloud was incredibly powerful in terms of some of the barriers that you're feeling to getting to that inclusive growth. I would also say that net zero and inclusive growth are not mutually exclusive. It's not about either or. It has to be about and. So working together, collaborating, not competing. There's a real opportunity for local authorities to show leadership, and you already are around the ambitious climate change targets. But actually there's real opportunity for you to do things differently in how you work, in how you procure, how you invest. It's actually walking the walk. You're big purchasers, you're big investors through your pension funds. There's opportunities for ethical and sustainable finance. Really interesting thinking and work going on in Scotland around this, the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, and some of the thinking that's coming out of the Bank of England here. But also it's really working with your local universities and your colleges to access that net zero expertise and some of the innovations that are happening there, but also supporting the development of the climate literacy and skills in the local workforce, so helping your local businesses with some of that. Planning also has an enormous role to play in terms of facilitating the design of places with social capital and natural capital at their heart to increase resilience. Again, river catchment management is a great example of this. Lots of local authorities are working together, looking at river catchment management, planting trees further upstream, rather than the hard engineering interventions further down the line. I think the thinking that the regulators are doing on some of this, so SEPA, for example, is actually, rather than coming in and punishing companies and organisations after the event, they're trying to work with them much earlier in the process, and they're actually beginning to do that convening of the different partners of local communities and of businesses to actually work together to find common solutions. With electricity demand likely to double or even treble, the UK government has recognised that onshore wind and solar should be eligible for support, so therefore planning authorities need to be prepared for applications for new sites, more repowering of existing sites, larger, more productive turbines. So there'll be a lot coming your way in that space as well. But real opportunities to work with the developers on community benefits as well, but proper community benefits that you've thought through with your citizens panels and so on, as Will was talking about. Again, a lot of that really compelling and huge similarities in thinking actually between what Will is saying and what was coming through from Charlie there. So finally, community energy. Good prospects for community energy in Scotland. Every local area has got a unique mix of technologies and networks. So actually the role for local authorities in coordinating that and pulling that together and thinking about that in the round and thinking about those whole life costs. Again, I really liked your slide, Charlie, about the capital expenditure. So a lot of thinking to be done there as well. Adaptation and mitigation investments needs to identify and prioritise your key economic assets. And at the Infrastructure Commission, we've been thinking not just about the economic assets, but also the social assets. We are unique in Scotland, again, in our Infrastructure Commission in looking not just at the economic infrastructure, but also thinking about schools and hospitals. And bringing that into our thinking around infrastructure planning and whole life costs. So, for example, the work that we've done investing in our schools in Scotland, has that actually delivered in terms of the outcomes that we were looking for in terms of educational achievement? So again, around that adaptation and mitigation, there's huge opportunities there around regeneration in coastal or riverside town centres, for example. Recent reports on the future of regulation have called for regulators to engage more at devolved and at regional level. So actually there's a real role to keep the pressure up and to keep playing your part there. Also working with your supply chains, being open about your missions. Again, Will's thinking about being that purpose-driven approach and sharing your missions with local industry, being open to innovative proposals from your supply chains on how you might be able to achieve them. We're back to the triple helix thinking all over again, aren't we? And then those high building standards, high standards for buildings, supporting that through your procurement and how you're buying things, and that appropriate sharing of risk and reward. It's the trade-offs. We need to do things differently. This is really hard for us all to learn because it's a different world, and how we work differently with our construction partners. Our current recycling systems are fragmented. There's a need to better understand the types and the quantities of materials that we've got in them. So that circular economy is going to mean longer, more complex value change. So that was just my halfpenny's worth. Telling my granny how to suck eggs here, because all of you know this an awful lot better than I do. But what I'd love to hear from you is what interesting things you are doing, what great things you are doing, some of the initiatives that you've got going on in local authorities. We really want to tell the story about that and share that knowledge and share that information for a better Scotland and a net zero Scotland. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks for listening.
Can I invite Charlie and Sara to the top table, and we'll look for some questions. Both of those inputs were really challenging, really encouraging, loads of opportunity, And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions in the audience. We'll have the roving mics again. I think there's one there and there's one here. So if you just raise your hand, and for Sara and Charlie's benefit, if you say who you are and where you're from, we can kick off a short Q&A. So we're who's going to be first? Yes. If we can maybe even kick off, if you don't have a question, you might have an observation. Katrina?
Yeah, we heard earlier from Will Hutton about a stakeholder economy, and I would like to hear a wee bit more about sort of corporate governance within the private sector, and what you think there is within the private sector an appetite for change around more social, environmental responsibility. You know, are the private sector open for that agenda, and how can we, as local authorities, engage locally with local companies to get them to be, you know, real stakeholders in our local economy?
I think you can elect to take it in turn.
Okay, yeah. Sara probably have much more to say on this. I mean, I think I talked about that community practice that we've had at EDASME, an event last year on different models of ownership from the simple limited company, and I'm interested in the degree to which companies are exploring the way of going into sort of B Corps. You know, this idea that it's not just shareholder value, that you actually have a much broader mission and purpose statement. Employee ownership as well is another area that quite a lot of organisations now are thinking about how, and there's a lot of there are a lot of number of tax benefits as well that can be generated as well. So I think that having that as part of the sort of certainly for those advising businesses, to even just encourage them to think about what some of the alternatives might be is quite interesting.
Thank you. My observation on this would be anecdotal, but my suspicion is that I think absolutely yes, but I think for the larger global corporates, of course, there's an understanding of these things. The danger is, of course, when it is just a kind of CSR paying lip service, as opposed to the Johnson & Johnson model, where actually they're looking at it, not Johnson & Johnson, the company that you cited earlier. Unilever, yeah. Well, yeah. There is an interview actually on Radio Scotland a couple of months back of the interviews that they do on Good Morning Scotland at the weekend, and there is an interview with Kevin, is it Schneider? So he's the global head of McKinsey. He's actually a Scotsman, who lives now in Hong Kong. But that was exactly the language and the thinking that he was using in terms of that advising of global corporates. And of course, actually, the climate change agenda has put massive scrutiny on these global corporates and the role that they're playing. So there's a lot more scrutiny of that activity and actually of what's investable. So the banks are starting to think very differently. They're falling over one another virtually every week. The banks are coming out with their new priorities. You had RBS the other week coming out. You know, climate change is in their top 3 things that they're looking at and thinking about. So actually, what's investable is changing massively. A huge glass and concrete building in central London is actually not looking like such an investable proposition now as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So I would say yes, in larger organisations, the challenge is always going to be for SMEs. I think organisations, economic development services and local authorities have a huge role to play here. I think SCDI has a huge role to play here. I'm very, very aware that in terms of our business base in Scotland, 70%, something like that, is made up of small businesses. So actually, these are the kinds of things that large corporates have dedicated teams to look at. If you're a wee business thinking about some of this stuff, what I would say is that learning is beginning to happen in our productivity clubs. So people are looking at productivity, but actually very often there are huge carbon gains as well. So there is that peer-to-peer transfer of learning is beginning to happen across those sectors. And actually that transfer of knowledge between the social enterprise sector in Scotland, I think we've got a really interesting social enterprise and charity sector in Scotland that is actually able to inform business. And business is thinking, well, actually, no, we need to do this differently. So you've got companies saying, we went to a 4-day week, and guess what? Our productivity went up. Our people are happier. They're more rested. So when they do work for us, they're actually delivering more. So they were making carbon savings at the same time as they were increasing their productivity. So there's just a lot more to do, I think, is the short answer to that. So sorry, that was a bit of a long and winding road.
If I may, I mean, just building on that, I mean, I think that, another dimension of this is the productivity thing, and if you bring in sort of fair work stuff as well, then Carnegie did some reduced report recently showing that places which adopt fair work approaches tend to be significantly more productive as well, and part of that fair work is actually treating employees as one of the key stakeholders in a sort of in a genuine way, not in a sort of lip service way. So I think that sort of productivity dimension is, I mean, it's back to the synergies point. There's a real business benefit as well as being the right thing to do.
It's also about talent attraction. So the ethical finance people that are based in Edinburgh are saying, we are getting the brightest and the best to come and work for us because they care about this agenda. So that's another, in terms of, and this is a real challenge for oil and gas, actually it's the reputational image for them is all important.
Okay, I think that would be an interesting dimension around the returns on investment and the social return on investment and the investment in prevention as well. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, Michael? And then I think Fergus really wanting in.
Thanks very much. Michael McGuinness from Western Bartonshire Council. I also chair the Place Group at Slade. I'm interested in the connection between the inclusive agenda and climate change. When we see, as you mentioned, Sarah, the amount of food banks we have in our communities, what do we tell these people about how climate change will help them? And I think that connection is so important, and how we communicate that is such a challenge. But if you get any ideas or thoughts how we can, examples of where that has been successful, possibly throughout the world?
Yeah, nice easy one. No, but you're spot on, actually, and it's this notion that climate change is something that can only be afforded by well-off people. Actually, guess what? The people that are in Waitrose with their four-wheel drives have a much larger climate footprint than people who are at food banks who don't have cars. It's a massive challenge for us, and I think there is this kind of perception that, and companies have been very clever at this. Supermarkets and retailers have been really clever at the kind of superficial. I mean, yes, it's having a bit of an impact, around your reusable and recyclable cups, but these are a drop in the ocean. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I've got the answer to that one, but you're absolutely right, and that is where I would point you to actually is the just transition work and the thinking that's coming out of the Just Transition Commission, but also the work of Catherine Trebeck, who will be speaking at our forum. We've got Peston and Caroline Criado Perez as well. We'll all have to cancel, and hopefully we'll see them again in September. But so there is some really interesting thinking about this. The challenge there is you get the kind of the argument is around, well, actually growth, no growth. Actually, what we need to do is stop growing.
I think there is something to do with how you frame things. People were saying earlier, and I suppose the example that I used around British Columbia, and there was a tax that they put on to reduce the amount of carbon emitted, but alongside that, they actually use the resources they generate to provide a dividend to people as well. So it depends on how you want to frame it, the balance you strike between those things.
I mean, that was an interesting question, Michael, but also flagged up earlier electronic poll was the lack of agreement on what we mean by inclusive growth as well, which is equally why it's difficult to answer. And, personally, I like the term inclusive economies rather than inclusive growth. So again, that might be something we can look at, how we change some of that language. I'm going to come back later on the tax and levy issue, but I think Fergus had a question over there.
Thanks again. It's Fergus Murray from our Gillinmute Council. To start on a positive, there's I think there's hundreds of examples of very good projects done by lots of people in this room and colleagues across local government. Things like change in response to climate change and regeneration and inclusion. Even like looking at all our streetlights and turning them to LED, which was a win because it gave us more income, but also was a massive saving in carbon, for example. And I could go on and on and on. But the reality check, the question I have, because facing with it, last 10 years, we've had single-year budgets, declining single-year budgets. So we could have much more of a lead role in local authorities if that issue was addressed. Because the budget pressures are all about the things that we're talking about there, about climate change, inclusion, regeneration of places. So if that doesn't change very quickly, then we're not going to play that lead role. So just your observations on that.
I suppose in a way that's why I've sort of raised this whole point about the distinction between capital and revenue. A lot of the things that are thought of as revenue spend can actually be reframed as being investments that will pay back in the future. It's not all being consumed now. So I think even reframing and thinking more broadly about that is important as well. And I think actually it's for the UK government as well, actually, to think. Obviously the mindset seems to have changed a little bit with the budget, and perhaps there is something like a magic money tree after all that needs to be thought about. Certainly, as far as quantitative easing was concerned, that was there was something there, wasn't there? But I don't know. I wouldn't want to go there. Gary might have a few thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, we'll let the economist answer the hard questions. But you're absolutely right. The notion of looking at these things in an annual way, when they particularly infrastructure, you're building things for 50, 100. You've got design lives. But I think one of the real challenges that we've come across in all the different infrastructure sectors, when we're thinking in the Infrastructure Commission, is around the whole life costs. So actually we might have invested in a terrific school or a new piece of infrastructure within our local authorities, but actually did we also think about the whole life costs and the investment costs? And it's right back to the potholes and then we our politicians at local level are left with invidious impossible decisions to make around actually, should we turn the old ladies over in their beds or should we fill in the potholes? Now, in that scenario, guess which one's going to be chosen? So yeah, very very difficult. But annual budgeting is no way to do these things, is it?
Okay, again, I suppose we're touching on the point Charlie made around cost and value, and being able to distinguish between the two, that they're actually two quite different things. I'm going to take Robert as the last question so we can press on, but we can come back to this. But having said we'll take Gary earlier, I don't then want to have him sitting longer. So we will come back to this, but if we take Robert's question as the last from the floor. Robert's got a mic, yeah.
You've got a mic. I've got a mic.
Okay.
Robert McGregor, Cosla. Sara referenced child poverty as part of the failing context. Do you think there's a risk of leaving child poverty as part of the backdrop rather than as part of the essential purpose of economic development?
No, I mean, I think that's got to be at the heart of, if you're talking about the economics of well-being or well-being economy or what have you, I mean, that has to be right at the heart of it. Well, alleviating has to be right at the heart of it.
Do you want to say anything on it? No. So I did say I'd come back just one final question before we conclude this. It's really to take the opportunity to pick your brains when you're here. You spoke about taxation and you spoke about levy, and local government have been pushing for more fiscal autonomy and more fiscal powers. If you were us, what would you be pushing for at a local level in terms of taxation or levy to help with the climate challenge and inclusion?
One observation I would make there is that in the past, the observation has been made that sometimes local authorities have powers but don't always use them. So sometimes they have some of those powers but don't necessarily, or maybe it's about capacity and an understanding of what the opportunities might be. There's some quite interesting thinking going on in Aberdeen, so I don't know if anybody's here from Aberdeen, but there were some interesting things that they did themselves around, round about the time of the last sort of crisis in Aberdeen, and the northeast economy being so dependent on oil and gas that actually, as a local authority, they did some really interesting things there. The stock market, I think, as I remember, yeah, on the bonds, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because obviously one of the things you're looking to do, doing it, I mean, ideally with going right to the top level with a sort of carbon tax, you're looking to do that as globally as possible, so that you aren't, so other places aren't disadvantaging themselves relative to each other. I mean, I was quite surprised when I read more about what British Columbia had done in that regard. So I wouldn't necessarily be sort of recommending that, but certainly looking at the powers that you do have. I mean, obviously, then you run into issues of quite sort of potent sort of local political angst as well, particularly things like congestion charging and all of that. But those sorts of things would be obvious. But you might need to think.
That's why we asked you the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that might be. But in terms of engagement, that might be something you want to do engage about. And I think the key to it is not just levying the charge, but actually being clear about what you can do with it as well, and what dividends will actually flow from it. And that's probably But I think I don't think you can just impose it. You definitely, that's part of the engagement to understand what might we do here differently.
Yeah, and I think the incentives there, as you mentioned as well. Can we show an appreciation to both Sara and Charlie for their input?